All right, well, let's get started. I'm Roland Wells, you know that. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for your word. We thank you that we have this tremendous gift of your word that comes and speaks to us. And through law and gospel, it comes and teaches us not only right and wrong, but gives us the promises of God. And faith comes from hearing. What is heard is those promises, the preaching of Christ. And we ask you, Lord Jesus, through this to open up our minds, our hearts, and our thoughts, and help us to understand a little better what you're doing in your word. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, we are going to be looking at the Gospel of Matthew for the next 6 weeks as an introduction to it. Why Matthew? Well, because this next year, starting in Advent, we're going to be in the year of Advent. The year of Matthew. We use a 3-year lectionary since the early church. In order to tell the whole story every year, wrapped around Easter and Christmas, we have the lectionary. And so the lectionary anchors on the 2 big holidays, which are Christmas and Easter. And if you may notice how the colors change, we have, just before the Christmas thing, we have 4 weeks of Advent. And that color traditionally was purple, although now we're using blue some as well. And then Christmas is gold or white, typically white. And then during the Epiphany, which moves like an accordion, depending upon where Easter is, that's green. So we've got preparation is purple, and celebration, which is white, and then proclamation, where we tell the story. In the Epiphany, we tell the early beginnings of Jesus' ministry. Then we go in preparation again, which we call, preparation before Easter is called Lent. Okay, I'll let you guys yell. I know it's maybe haven't had coffee yet, but anyway. And then we have Easter, and Easter is a much longer celebration. Christmas is only 12 days. Easter is 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and then we get Pentecost, which is one of the red ones, one of the rare red ones, and then we have a whole year of green to tell the story. But through that whole time, we're going to be using Matthew to tell the preparation of Jesus coming, and then the Christmas story, and then the beginning of his ministry, and then we'll have the teachings throughout the Epiphany of his beginning of it. Then we've got the preparation in Lent, again Matthew. So the whole year we'll have Matthew, but we're going to be looking at how is Matthew different. How many Gospels do we have? 4. Okay, and let's go from here so I don't blather on. Now my noble assistant is going to help me with our notes. Now you have 2 options here. You have in front of you everything that's going to be in all 6 lectures, at least as planned at this point, are in this set of sheets. Now you can follow along on that, but that's kind of cheating. But if you learn better that way, cheat. But you also have a fill in the blank in front of you, which you may find helpful to get things memorized, get them into your head. All you have is 1 day's worth of that this Sunday. Or you may find it really distracting. So do what you think. Now these words that are in white up there, those are the words in the fill in the blank. So you can do that, and it may help you and it may distract you. So whatever works best for you, do. So, all right, how the Gospels came to us. No living human being knows how the 4 Gospels were written or transmitted. It's not written down anywhere. The Gospels don't tell us. We don't know. Scholars look for hints and they make guesses. The Bible doesn't tell us. The early church fathers, there's only one mention, and that person says Matthew came first. But it's not as authoritative as the Bible, and it seems to be wrong. But we'll get to that. If we study the Gospels and their differences, we can gain a better understanding of why each author presents the story the way they do. They've got an agenda. All right? So, Jesus spoke Aramaic, we believe. That's what everybody spoke. It was a simplified version of Hebrew. It was spoken all the way across the whole Fertile Crescent area in that area. That was the main language, Aramaic. It's a Semitic language. It's the father of today's Arabic and many other languages that are broken down from it. The Aramaic came out of the Hebrew thing, but it's actually the language that was spoken by the Assyrians. It's not in the notes, I'm adding. Okay, so we surmise that Jesus and the disciples spoke Aramaic, and Jesus grew up in Galilee of the Gentiles. So you've got Israel, shaped like a banana, kind of. And the bottom is Judah, or Judea as it's called in the New Testament, because that's the Roman name. And then in the middle is Samaria, where people of a different religion lived. When the Assyrians took Samaria was the capital of, after the split of Israel. The northern kingdom was called Israel, southern kingdom was called Judah. And when the Assyrians took the entire people of Israel away, they brought back in other people that mixed with the people. You need a copy of each of these handouts here. So, okay. Anyway, and so they had all kinds of other religious ideas. There was idol worship. There was all kinds of junk, and they just didn't get along. You know the story of the Good Samaritan. Okay, and that's, by the way, where the West Bank Palestinians live now. It's fascinating that the Palestinians live in two places. They live where the Philistines, same thing, lived during the time of David, caused all the problems. And then you have in Jesus' day, you've got the Samaritans, and they caused all kinds of problems. Exactly the same places where the Palestinians live today. Some things never change. Anyway, and then above Samaria was Galilee. But Galilee had been conquered by everybody. They were conquered by the Assyrians, conquered by the Babylonians, by the Persians, by the Greeks, by the Egyptians, and maybe by your great-grandmother. They had been overrun by many cultures, but then those cultures left people behind. There were colonies of different languages, different groups, and there was a tremendous amount of travel. But so there were in their midst these remnant communities that spoke all kinds of languages. Now, if you ever have read, there was a book that James Michener wrote back in the 60s called The Source. Now, archaeologically and biblically, it's not very accurate, but they go through a tell, which is one of these cities, mud brick cities that had been built up by layer after layer after they're destroyed, and so they just kind of tamp it all down and build the next layer on top of that with mud brick houses. Well, digging through this tell, and he tells the story of the tell of this mound, and it's fascinating because it really helps you to understand all the different cultures that were there and were interacting, and one had replaced the other, but they all left something of themselves behind. So the good people of Judah in the south, thought of them as real mutts, and they were. Now, not only is that going on, but Galilee was at the junction of the north-south and the east-west trading routes. Now realize all the trade from east-west, the Silk Road, stuff coming out of China, all that stuff going across the whole of Asia, cinnamon and silk and all kinds of other stuff, that was all being traded. People were moving tin, sailing tin and moving tin across the Mideast, 2200 BC. There was a lot of traffic going on back and forth, and north and south. Ivory, the Bible talks a lot about ivory. Ivory didn't grow much in Israel, in the Mideast. That all comes out of Africa. So they were not only at these trade routes, but they were meeting people. They were probably meeting Chinese people. They were meeting European people. There's a reason why God created all the stuff around Jesus and the Old and New Testaments right at the place where the entire world crosses. In fact, if you take a world map today and you map out the geographic center of the entire world, it's right there. All three races, all three traditions met right there. Okay, this is not in the notes. Okay, so you got a land bridge, and so Jesus may have spoken Greek, and certainly as the God of the universe, he could speak anything he wanted to. But we're not told that he did. The Gospels are written in Greek. After Alexander the Great came through at about 300 BC, Alexander the Great forced everything official to be done in Greek. That's why the New Testament's in Greek. He pushed all the way over to India. They marched off the map all the time. He actually conquered Afghanistan. Nobody else did. Came back and died in Babylon, but that's why everybody on that whole side all spoke the common language of Greek. Okay, so we believe that we're not they're written in Greek, but we believe primarily Jesus spoke Aramaic. That's all we know. When we hear Jesus speak, we do hear Jesus speak some Aramaic, but only a few Aramaic words in the verses where those are at or in the bottom. Okay, so we think he spoke Aramaic. The Bible comes to us in Greek. We can see there's been some transmission going on. But let's see, how did it happen? How did it get picked up in the first place? Well, it's very plausible that a disciple or someone else with them took notes on what Jesus said. We don't know. We know that people who are illiterate have a much greater ability to memorize and grasp something a speaker says. You know, currently in America, last time I checked, an American attention span, because of TV and so forth, your attention span is 6 seconds. A goldfish is 8 seconds. Okay, so speakers have to do songs and dances and shoot off pistol blanks and all kinds of things to get you back engaged, tell jokes. All right, we don't know if Jesus' words were originally passed around somehow in Aramaic. That's possible. Some people think the Gospel of Mark may have originally been written in Aramaic. Or if they were translated very early to Greek. That could be too, because a lot of people spoke Greek. So that koine means common Greek. We just don't know. Now, were the disciples literate? The estimates are that only 10 to 15% of the people there could read and write. Think of that. Acts 4:13. Oh, this is a real humdinger. Okay, Acts 4:13 says, "Now, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, and perceived that they were uneducated common men," we're going to look at that. Uneducated common men, they were astonished that they were up speaking and talking about it. And they recognized that they had been with Jesus. Wouldn't it be nice if everybody recognized that with us? Okay, so uneducated. What does that mean? Well, the Greek word is agrammatoi. Agrammatoi literally means unlettered. Illiterate. Common. And then common men. Now this is the real hoot. Common men, the Greek word is idiotai. Yep, idiotai. Quite the bunch. I guess Jesus wasn't fussy, there's hope for us. All right, so let's talk now a little bit about the relationship between Matthew and Mark and Luke. Okay, we're going to call these, scholars forever have called them the synoptics. Syn with optic, to look. They look together. They turn their heads together. They tell the story the same way. And that, because they tell the story so much the same way, we can learn much about what their agenda is and what they're trying to do by the differences, okay? Most scholars across the theological spectrum, I'd have to say all of them, agree that Matthew and Luke had some form of Mark's gospel in front of them when they wrote their version. Mark was first, but we'll be looking at this at great length. As we look at the synoptics side by side, we can see that in most of their books, they tell the same story. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In the same order, with even the same narration words in between, which is just shocking. When you first hit it, like, it's the same words. I mean, all right, that's what it happened. They're exactly the same. So there's a textual connection. And by looking at these differences, we can begin to discern the differences between each writer's agenda. By the way, if you have a question at any point along the way, just raise your hand up. We'll stop and do that. Don't be afraid. So let's go to start now with Mark. Mark speaks very rudimentary Greek. He's kind of at my weekly reader Greek. He has no birth story, right? Or any of the other introductory material that the others have. At the end of Mark's gospel, our most ancient texts tell us that the women come to the empty tomb and they run away afraid. You see an angel, that happens. Mark is in a hurry. We're going to see this later on. Mark is in a hurry to get the information out, the message out. His main word that links the sections, one thing to the next, is immediately, immediately, immediately. He uses it over 50 times in his, handful of chapters. Immediately. Matthew and Mark often polish it out when they go through the same thing. We're going to see that. Mark would have gotten probably pretty bad marks in freshman English for his style, because he's not a Greek speaker. He is writing, it's not bad, but it's a lot better than I can do. But it's his system is very, and he throws in all these weird details that the other writers kind of just, you don't need that. But wait till you see what Matthew does. All right. So as we look at the synoptics, there is so much shared between the three synoptics. But there are parts that Matthew and Luke has that Mark doesn't. And that's fascinating, because we've got these pieces that Mark and Luke have some unique materials. Is that the right slide? It is, okay. That Mark doesn't have. So these are usually parts that they alone share in slightly different forms. Usually they're sayings. You know how Solomon in Proverbs, you've got all these sayings and they're kind of connected by what they're about? There's some of that going on in the material that Matthew and Luke have. So it's like Proverbs. So Jesus begins teaching. If you read Matthew, everything up to chapter 4 is his genealogy, and then it's got the calling of the disciples. Well, you've got all the birth narrative stuff, and you've got the wise guys. No, you've got the magi. Yeah, the wise guys. And all those, we come up to, there's really no action. Jesus really doesn't say anything until Matthew 5. And then Matthew 5, Jesus sits down and gives several chapters of a sermon. Okay, so we're going to be taking a look at that. So now, if we look at that beginning of 5, no, we want to go back. Go back. No, what happened? Where's our picture? Oh yeah, okay, that'll be the next one. All right, one of the tools that we have today, and this must have been a nightmare to set up type for. This book is called the Synopsis of the Four Gospels. And I'm glad that I bought the one that has English on one side and Greek on the other, because if I just had Greek, which is what they told us to buy, it would not have been half as handy. This book I've used so much in the last 50 years that I had to have it rebound because it fell apart. And what this has every gospel story all the way through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and if John happens to have anything regarding it, which he doesn't, it's there. Now this happens to be a chapter, the healing of the paralytic, and it has the it's color coded, and we can see here, for example, here's Mark's story. Now where you see green, it's exactly the same words in all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. However, Luke has a fancy introduction, which is, and these orange spots are where he shares it with Mark. Has taken some of Mark's words. You can see that Matthew has ripped out big chunks of it because I don't need that. I don't need that. And then we get over to the actual story of the healing of the paralytic. Look how much green. That's word for word, letter for letter, exactly in the Greek, the same words. Okay, so nothing. I mean, you look at it, it's very, very clear that that's the case. But look how much white is in Matthew. Matthew just edits everything out he doesn't need. So it comes up later in the text here, but if Matthew were to be asked to describe himself in 25 words or less, he'd say, concise. So now let's take a look at the text in front of us up here. Let's go to that. So if we look here, these are the Beatitudes. And somebody once said, Beatitudes, those are attitudes to be. I think that's probably a little too cheap, but anyway. Now when we look at this, Matthew and Luke each have some unique material that I want to get this one here first. Okay, so we take a look at this. We can see that Matthew has blessings. Now, again, we'll be explaining as to why Jesus starts with, why Matthew uses these words of Jesus to start his speech, to start his presentation of what Jesus says. What he's saying is the opposite of what the Pharisees said. Pharisees said, if life's going bad, you've sinned. If you've got a sick child, you were the child that sinned. It's all your fault. If you are sad, it's your fault. If we can tell this, if something's going bad in your life, it's because you're a rotten, lousy sinner, not like us. Okay? I don't happen when a Pharisee had a sick child, but okay. So look at Matthew. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed, blessed, blessed. Now Luke, when we get to the Sermon on the Plain, now maybe Jesus repeated himself. We don't know. Was this something where they had these sayings and organized them? We've got, blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. But then he's got a curse afterwards, a woe. Now, the word woe, ever hear somebody say, oi, gewalt, in Hebrew? Okay, oi, it's a cry of death. Oi, oi! I did that one time in a sermon, too close to the mic, and about half the congregation came up and I had somebody really complain about that. Hated to wake him up. Blessed are you that hunger. Okay, blessed are who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Remember this, the Pharisees are obsessed with righteousness. Blessed are those who hunger for thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Woe, oi, to you who are full now, for you shall hunger, and so forth. And then down the bottom, you've got blessed are those who are persecuted, blessed when you're reviled, and so forth. And some of this is picked up by Luke. But this is important in Matthew's day because the Christians, as we're in this split, as Christianity and what would become Judaism are splitting, they were picked on in this by the Jewish people, some that way, because they were trying to preserve something too. All right, so with the synopsis here, that's available to you for free. I put a footnote in here. You can get that on your phone, and you can look at what Matthew did and how they relate to each other for free. You don't have to spend more than $100 for this book. You don't have to lug it around. I've lugged this book around. I've had it in Ecuador, I've had it in Mexico. That's why it was falling apart. But you don't have to lug it around. You've got it on your phone. It's free. This is a tool nobody's had. It's only about 100 years old. Nobody'd ever done this before. You have tools that no one in the history has ever had before on how to study the Bible. And it's all online and it's all free. And most of it isn't screwy. Some of it is, but not much. You're smart enough to figure that one out. All right. So let's go on with the gospel writers tell about their own agendas. All right, the gospel writers themselves tip their hat as to what they're doing a little bit. Two of them do. So Luke, we've got Luke 1 through 4. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile the narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. Oh, we're speaking fancy language, Dr. Luke. Remember, he's the dear and glorious physician, right? He writes very fancy Greek, very different than the other four, by the way. Things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. So he's saying, did he get them firsthand? No, he got them from those who were eyewitnesses. So he's secondhand, all right? It seemed good to me also, having followed all these things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account. He's moving things around in a way so that he can tell the story better. That's what he just said, isn't it? To write an orderly account for you, O excellent Theophilus. Theophilus. We'll look at that. That you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Certainty. All right. Luke shows us that here that he's organizing his materials. He's editing the material that he has before him, and he's aiming it at his target. And Luke's target is a Greek-speaking, literate, Gentile believers someplace in the Roman Empire, in the Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire. But now remember, if you were educated if you're even over here in Rome, you still had to know Greek. This is why when your doctor uses those fancy words, they're supposedly Latin. I can understand much of what he's saying because it's all Greek to him and me. All right, because Greek and Latin are very closely tied. So Theophilus, is that a person's real name? It means God lover or God friend, which could certainly be somebody's name, right? Or a nickname, or perhaps written to all God lovers, God friends, right? Who want to know Jesus' story. So Luke's writing is actually part of a 2-volume set, Luke Acts. Luke is trying to tell the story about how did this hole-in-the-wall stuff way over on the other side of the Mediterranean. How did that story about this guy Jesus get all the way across the Mediterranean? And that's what the story of the book of Acts is. It starts out in Jerusalem, it starts out with a whole bunch of people, and it gradually ends up more and more focusing on Paul, and Paul getting his way to Rome, right? So it kind of narrows down to just what's going on with Paul. So Luke is writing an orderly account. Luke explains a lot of Old Testament material because the Gentiles wouldn't understand that. And doing it with a fancier vocabulary than the other Gospels. That's Luke. Now, John, any questions, comments, recipes? Okay. Now, John tells us about the book, about his book as well. And John doesn't do it till the very end, but it's good that he did. John 21:25. Now, there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Isn't that cool? Here's his good friend. He's carefully choosing the very special parts. Why? So that you may believe. So that you may believe. John's gospel is so very different from the other three. We talked about this last year. He chooses to tell his story very differently from the other three. We call Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as I said, the synoptic gospels because they look together. John sees things very differently. John's book is notable that the things that he doesn't tell us. There are no parables in John's gospel. Think of that. There's no birth story. There's no story of Jesus' baptism, although it refers to it, and when you read it fast, you think, well, I just read the baptism story. No, you didn't. You just had a little mention of it, but it carries the theological information that he needs. He doesn't tell even one of the same miracles that the synoptics tell. Isn't that fascinating? They told the story first. We believe John's gospel is written maybe 5 to 10 years later. They told the story first. Now John is going to show us what it means. See, John's theology is so developed that starting with the skeptics in the early 1800s, people said, well, John's gospel must have been written, this is not in your notes, it must have been written maybe in the 300-400s. It's all this stuff about the Lord's Supper and all these theological things. They couldn't possibly have developed that early. He was writing, he's got thoughts from the Gnostics, even the middle 20th century, Bultmann. Oh, it's all Gnosticism. It was all written later. It was written by somebody else. Well, then about the middle of the 20th century, they discovered some, I'm thinking on the word, that's paper that the Egyptians used made out of reeds. Papyrus, thank you. They found papyri buried in the sand where the Egyptians used to bury their dead with copies of the Book of the Dead, which had curses in their beliefs of their gods. Well, when people became Christians in Egypt, the rich people could afford to have copies of the New Testament, or portions of the New Testament, put in their coffins. They start digging up in the dry sand, and they find copies of these documents that are beautifully preserved. We've seen some of them in Ireland, and they're beautifully done papyri. So now that puts us into the 200s and 300s. Now, just recently, and I haven't been following it a lot, but just within the last decade, they have found burial masks. The Egyptians weren't very wealthy in later days, and so they would bury people in paper mache fancy coffins. And you've seen all those mummy movies and the fancy coffin and so forth. Well, they made them out of paper mache. It's a little cheaper than carving them out of granite. And they found some of these, and they started looking, and some of them, the paper mache was made out of copies of the Bible, papyrus. And here they're from the end of the 1st century, within 10 years of when it was written. Now think of that. The skeptics, there's plenty of skeptics out there. 20 years ago there was the Jesus Project voting on which were the words were the words of Jesus and which ones were made up later. there's just absolutely no validity in saying you can do that, because we've got texts that go back and they're very carefully moved, copied along. The Dead Sea Scrolls, Old Testament stuff. It's interesting. If you ever, what's the story where Jesus was supposedly married to Mary Magdalene came out a few years ago. It was a book and then it was a movie.
Angels and Saints?
Pardon?
Angels and Demons?
No. This is a bad book, bad movie, bad book. But anyway, it claimed that the New Testament had documents and the Dead Sea Scrolls. No. They thought at the beginning of the 20th century that the Old Testament was just full of mistakes and rewritings, and you got one commentary on Psalms from that era, and the writer just goes through and she tries to put all the poetry into Greek rhythms. And he says, obviously there's a change here, and this should be the word, and this should be the word. No, the Hebrew poetry is by repeating it in different words. And so there was no changes. When we get up until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest original Hebrew scrolls we had were from about 1000 AD. All of a sudden with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we jump back 1200 more years. And guess what? Nobody changed them. Oddly enough, did the people who taught you Sunday school lie? Mine didn't, I don't think. I never caught them at it. No, we've all been very careful. All right, so we've got that John has written because he wants you to believe. All right, so which came first, the chicken or the egg? What do I mean? Which came first, the letters or the Gospels? The New Testament is made up of 4 Gospels, and then there's the early history of the church in Acts. And then you've got a whole bunch of letters by Paul and others. And then you've got Revelation, which tells us about the end in picture language. Now, those many letters in there by Paul and Peter and others, those are priceless. And they teach about doctrine. They teach, Paul is, Paul's letters, all the different things that he talks about. Paul's writings make up about a half of the New Testament. Pretty amazing. Now, Paul was converted a few years after Jesus went back up to heaven, probably a little younger, but maybe about the same age as John, or even a little younger than that. And then he was martyred during the reign of Nero, which was about 66 AD. Now, Paul didn't write much after he died. Okay, he lost his head under Nero and so on. But here's the curious fact, and you can sit and think about this all week. Paul rarely quotes Jesus. Of all the teaching he's doing, if you were teaching about what Jesus taught, wouldn't you be quoting Jesus a bunch? Paul quotes Jesus exactly 4 times. Somehow Paul has learned Jesus' teachings and absorbed them and systematized them and tied them to all the Old Testament stuff, because he was a trained Pharisee. But Paul doesn't quote Jesus in order to back up his teachings. And you know why? Me neither. Nobody else does. But we think if he's killed in 66 AD, that's pretty early. Now, the words of the Gospels in the final form we have aren't mentioned by any of the other letter writers either. Although some of Jesus' teachings are echoed. Another hint is the dating of the New Testament books is the emphasis in the Gospels on the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, in 60 AD, the Zealots, who are even listed, some of the disciples were Zealots. The Zealots decide to kill off the garrison of Romans and declare freedom. Not a good idea. So they rose up and they tried to throw the rascals out, but they just had a small garrison there. And when Rome heard about it, guess what? Well, they came back and they showed their displeasure and they punished those who rose up. So the writers say that they carefully picked and chose what they included. So it's notable that there's quite a bit of a mention about Jesus' teachings about the destruction of the temple. Now those words are very, very important. Now I'm not saying that they put words in Jesus' mouth, but it became so central in their teaching because it had already happened. I think that's what most scholars think. So because the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem happened just as Jesus said it would, it was very significant to those who had become impoverished refugees because of it. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews were pushed out of Israel, or out of Judea. Can you imagine how horrible that would be? Just gone, you can't live here anymore. And it was beyond Pearl Harbor, it was beyond 9/11. All these people were pushed out, their city was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, and they find themselves all over the world. And that includes both the Jews and those who were Messianic Jews, who believed in Jesus as the Mashiach, the Christ. By the way, you all know this, but I'll just say it because I didn't know this when I was young. Christos, Christ, means Messiah. It wasn't his last name, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus Christ. No, Christ means it's a title. Jesus the Messiah. So, thus it's reasonable to surmise that some form of the gospel, maybe Mark, may have been passed around in writing sometime around 40, 50 AD. We have no proof of that. But some people think that there must have been some early written documents. There's no mention of any of this, how it was written. It looks like the Gospels that we have, though, probably came into their final form at some point after 70 AD. Okay? Questions, thoughts? All right. So let's take a look at Matthew's task and his and situation. We're almost there. Okay. We can see in Matthew's tendency to say things in the fewest possible words. If Matthew was asked to describe himself, as I said, 25 words or less, he'd say concise. So let's look at how Matthew edits Mark's account of Jesus stilling the storm. Okay, you can look up here or you can look on your sheets. But let's take a look here. So we've got, we can see in Matthew 8, now when Jesus saw great crowds around him, he gave orders to go to the other side. That's the introduction. And when he got in the boat, his disciples followed. Now Mark had said, on that day when evening had come, he said, let us go across the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him in the boat just as he was, other boats were with him. Okay, so Matthew took out other boats were with him. It says, let us go, takes out, let us go across the other side. Talks about leaving the crowd. All we got is, and he got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Okay, Luke has an introduction too, with some of the same stuff in it. And then, and behold. Now behold's a fun word. It means, look, yo. It's in the Old Testament. It's the response that everybody has when God calls him. God calls Samuel and he says, Hineni, yo, here I am. And so when you see that, it's the same word all the way, Old Testament, New Testament, different word in Greek. Behold, you do, look. That's another connecting word. It's kind of like a little exclamation point in the side, in the front of it. So, behold, there was a great storm on the sea, so the boat was being swamped by the waves. Now, what does Mark have? Great storm and wind, and the waves beat into the boat. So the boat was already filling, but he was in the stern. Look what Matthew's got. Being swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. He's just edited all that stuff out. Right? And they went and woke and said, Lord, we are saved, Lord, we are perishing. And you got over here, he's asleep on the cushion in the stern. And they woke him and said, Teacher, don't you care if we perish? That same thing. And now Luke also said, no, we don't need all this stuff about the cushions, and we don't need, and Master, we're perishing. Same word, perish. Now, Jesus' words there, why are you so afraid of men of little faith? He arose and rebuked the wind and the sea. Mark tells us, peace, be still, and the wind ceased. There's a great calm. Great calm. And again, blank. Now, you've got, I don't have my pointer with me here, but you notice we do have the mention of faith here. Have you no faith? O men of little faith, so that's in there. They're filled with awe and marveled. Who is this that even the wind and sea obey him? So you can see that the major points are there. But Matthew is just a really good editor. He's just redlining all kinds of stuff. You know, why waste ink? It's going to be easier to carry this thing around and hand copy it and so forth. But he wanted to make sure that he just made this thing as clean and carried what was necessary. We'll see this over and over again. We're going to take a look at another text here pretty quick. So let's, I gave you another handout here. Why don't you grab that handout, this one with the lovely finger on the top. I printed these out last night. I realized that I would like to have a little more information, a little more content for you. And so I went to scan these on my scanner, but instead of scanning as a JPEG, they came up as PDFs. And at that point, late at night, I thought, I don't really, it would be nice to make it look nicer, but it's not going to happen. So, okay, let's take a look here, and let's look at the story of Jairus' daughter and the woman with the hemorrhage. So, we see, we all got the front page. We're going to start here. Okay. So, again, one thing to watch for is how much white there is in Matthew. Matthew, again, tells it concisely. So, we've got Mark. I'm going to read Mark, and then I want you to follow along in Matthew. So, and when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came out one of the rulers of the synagogue. Note the word ruler, okay? You just saw the word ruler in yours? Mm-hmm. Named Jairus, and seeing, fell at his feet and besought him. Okay, now, what you've got in front of you there doesn't have synagogue. Matthew's got an agenda for synagogue and for Pharisees and for rabbis, but he doesn't want to confuse it, because he's talking just about the authority of Jesus here, so he trims that all out. So the guy says, this ruler comes and says, my daughter has just died. Now that's a little different. There's materials over there, grab one each, okay? My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live. Now this is very different from what Mark has. Can you see it? My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her. Hands, okay? Laying on of hands, so that she may be made well and live. By the way, well means, that's soteros, the same as whole, which means saved, same word, okay? And may live, and may live. Okay, so there we've got the story set up. Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. Now the others don't talk about his disciples. Now, a second story is interwoven. So we're going to go to Mark, and great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. Okay, TMI, he says, we just need to have hemorrhage for 12 years. Boom. All right. Now notice we've got the word physicians. You notice that in the front? Now notice the same story is being told by Luke. What's missing there? There's no mention of physicians spending all the money with the physicians. He's doing a little PR for the AMA, I think. But anyway, I get a kick out of that he says, even though he says flow of blood for 12 years and could not be healed by anyone. But the word physicians does not appear, interestingly. I think that's kind of humorous. Okay, so, all right, Matthew. So they suffered from a hemorrhage for 12 years and came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. Just touched the fringe of his garment. And she said to herself, if I only touch his garment, I shall be made well. That's a lot of faith. Now notice how much white there is in the next section. And by the way, I thought I'm going to need a little more material, and I didn't pick this up because this is a famous verse to prove what I'm saying. It was just the first thing I came to that had a bunch of white. You go through the synopsis, you're going to see this over and over and over again. That's how Matthew does stuff. All right, so now we've got Mark's long discussion. If I touch even his garments, I shall be made well. And immediately the hemorrhage ceased, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone forth from him, immediately turned around. And I noticed a little arrow there. Notice that Luke also talks about power. Okay. So perceiving himself that power had gone forth from him, what's Mark's word? Immediately turned in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" By the way, if that song, "He touched me, oh, he touched me," okay, probably comes from this. And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing that what had been done to her, came in fear and trembling and fell before him and told him the whole truth. All right, there's some of that in Luke. Matthew's got what? Jesus turned and seeing it said to her, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well, has made you whole, has saved you." Instantly the woman had been made well. Okay. Now we pick up the story again. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble your teacher any further?" But ignoring what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Now, we just talked about believing earlier here. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John and the brother of James. Now Matthew says, don't need that stuff. Isn't that interesting? He just goes on with the story. So we read, woman was made well. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players, now why does he mention that? That's interesting. Because the other ones don't have that. And the crowd making a tumult, that's from Mark, he said, "Depart, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Now you can see that that's also in a longer form in Mark. And then we go on here in Mark, but he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Don't have to have those details. He goes in, he went in and took her by the hand. That's it. And the girl arose. And this report went out through the whole district. Now, that's all we need to know, wasn't it? Isn't that fascinating? I don't know how you look at this and can't say that there's a connection between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I mean, obviously, we can see that there's stuff going on here that where there's editing and there's, okay, and now we'll go back over to Mark here. And immediately, the girl got up and walked, and she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement, and strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to get her something to eat. Now, why would be getting her something to eat important? Well, yeah, she was living, and she wasn't just a spirit. Now, as we get into that later time in the first century, we have a problem with people who are claiming, well, when Jesus was resurrected, he was just a spirit body, and this girl's probably just a ghost. There's a ghost there. Ghosts do that kind of thing. No, both Mark and the physician Luke want to make clear, no, this girl's alive and kicking. She's eating stuff, as any good 12-year-old should be. So we've got an almost 13-year-old in our family. He's insatiable. So these are some of the things we look at as we look at the study of Matthew, that Matthew's textually related to Mark and to Luke. He's got an agenda, and we're going to see more about that, particularly aimed at the relationship of the teachings of Jesus fulfilling the Old Testament and being the true continuation of the Old Testament faith. That's his big thing. So that's what we're going to be looking at the next several weeks. So, all right, we ended up pretty quick here. I can get up and practice bass guitar, but thoughts or questions? Is this new stuff to you? Or have you known this all along? Talk people. Yeah.
I'm just gonna say, they really didn't collaborate on that.
We don't know if they ever met face to face,
Yeah.
but they did it in this kind of the same way. If you read somebody else's sermon for ideas and then kind of mine it and then yeah.
Like with Matthew, I forget things
Yeah.
and don't put them down. This is inspired by God, that we believe.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, we don't know exactly how it was passed along. There's all kinds of guesses, but they're just educated guesses by looking carefully at the text, so. Anyway. Other thoughts?
It's very fun to compare the different gospels this way.
Have you ever done that before? No, okay. You have, okay.
Not to this extent.
The men's Bible study on Monday night.
Good, good. I have just found that hardly anybody's ever done this, and I don't know why. Maybe it's because the synopsis is more of a modern type thing, but I mean, they were doing this without the tools 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, comparing them and looking at the message. But we've got really good materials now, and so anyway, that's what we're going to do and have some fun with it. And he's Mathew, even though he's this kind of dry editor that cuts so much stuff out, he's got this agenda, and he's really got this kind of, it's almost funny, some of the stuff he does, and the way that he takes these words and really focuses them right at the competition, so to speak. He is not anti-Semitic. He does not hate the Jews. Jesus did not hate the Jews, but there was a very honest competition of two groups of people that were both trying to be faithful. But it didn't work. The Pharisees had taken things a bad direction, so we'll be looking at that. Other comments, questions?
I did want to say about some of the distortions in like movies and things we're talking about. You go back to Jesus Christ Superstar, and now there's one out with Nicolas Cage. He's supposed to be Jesus, but it's all distorted.
Yeah.
And I thought he had become a Christian, but man, you see the things that he's doing in this movie, it's not.
Yeah, it's the thing is when we take a look at these movies done by Hollywood and so forth, it's kind of a Rorschach test. Jesus you'll portray as the one that you've imagined, and each of us have a picture of Jesus and what he said and what he was like, and we've got to be careful we don't end up with a Mr. Potato Head Jesus, kind of a symbol of ourselves. It's always a fun sermon illustration, put them together wrong, but good. Thoughts or comments, anything beyond that? Just pop into your head, please feel very free to stop. Yeah.
What was the name of your book?
The name of the book here?
Yeah.
Synopsis of the Four Gospels. But as I said, you can get it, I put the footnote in the text, the website, that it's,
Can you still purchase a published book like that?
oh, sure. I go on abebooks.com, Abe like Abe Lincoln, abebooks.com, and make sure you get the one that has both English and Greek. English kind of helps you, but it's nicer to be able to go over and take a look at actually what the Greek actually says. And it's probably a lot cheaper than what we paid for it at the time. But I can't imagine functioning without it, because I've just used the dickens out of this thing over the years. I'm not a great scholar, not a great Greek scholar, but I've always tried to lead Bible studies from the Greek. So almost for the whole time, from the time I was in seminary to the time I was retired, to try to constantly have some kind of study going from the original languages. And I've spent as much as 2 years, word by word in the Greek, going through John, which is my first love. And that was very helpful. And it primes the pump, and you can work to gain an understanding that way, and by getting in and wrestling with this stuff, and there's no bottom to it. You get to these things, and you just look at it, and there's just so much stuff there. You never hit the bottom, so it's kind of fun. Anyway, I'm trying to think of the name of that. It was a great big movie. Why can't I think of the name of that movie? He wrote a whole bunch of other things too. Knights Templar and extended and so forth. But anyway, we'll work that up for next week.
Da Vinci Code.
Yes, the Da Vinci Code. That's it. Thank you. The ever-encroaching senility. Who came up with it? Good work. Good work. Yeah, the Da Vinci Code. Remember, my sister-in-law got all caught up in that. Oh, I shouldn't say that. And she said, well, it says right in the front that this whole story is true. I said, that's the first lie. It's so totally inaccurate. and it's got all kinds of weird agendas in it, but anyway. All right, fine. If you have no more questions, go get some more coffee and we'll talk to you later. Thank you.